Good evening, everyone. This is Don Moffett with the Division of Policy and Program Development, and thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to be providing an overview of the HCBS 1915C Comprehensive Waiver Amendment that we have pending. So joining me this evening is Kate Marley, as well as Lauren Porter. Kevin Valentes from the Division of Enterprise Solutions is going to be joining us as well, along with Donna Cater from the Department of Health. So just a few housekeeping points before we get started. Today's session is being recorded. A copy of today's presentation will be available on OPWD's website on the Home and Community-Based Services landing page. If you experience any connection issues during tonight's presentation, if you could please send an email to us at the People First Waiver mailbox, and that address is People First Waiver, all one word, no spaces, at opwdd.ny.gov, and we will try to assist with those connection issues. So again, if you run into any connection issues, please reach out to us and let us know, and we'll try to assist. Also, we are tracking questions, and we will leave some time at the end for Q&A. Okay, so with that being said, what is the purpose of today's session? Well, the purpose of today's session is to provide a very brief overview of the HCBS waiver. We would like to, provide a summary of some of the organizational pieces with the waiver, provide some information on how it's organized, how it's laid out, as well as identify some areas that are anticipated to be changing with the waiver amendment. So with that being said, let's move forward and begin to take a look at today's topics. So our agenda for this evening is really four primary areas. The first is, where can I find the waiver? Where can I find the waiver? Where can I find the waiver amendment? The public comment period. Again, a brief overview of what the waiver is, as well as an overview of the changes that are pending. So, where can I find the waiver? Well, there's a couple of places where you can find the current waiver amendment that's been proposed, and one option is you can view an electronic copy of it on our OPWDD website. The link to that copy is on the slide in front of you in the top arrow. Another option to view a copy of the proposed waiver amendment is each one of our regional offices statewide have a hard copy of the waiver amendment, and they are available for review. And just in case you don't already know where your local regional office is located, or perhaps where you can go to view a copy of the waiver, this slide in front of you provides the addresses for each of those physical location sites. So I'm just going to leave that up for 1 or 2 seconds so folks can scroll to find the address for their regional office. Okay, so our next agenda item is the public comment period. So when is the public comment? Well, we began a 30-day public comment period on this past Monday, June 1st. That public comment period will remain open through Wednesday, July 1st. And during that time period, if you have any comments that you'd like to make about the information that we're going to go over this evening, or any comments that you would like to share with OPWDD with regards to the waiver in general, please feel free to send those comments in. So there's really a couple of different ways that you can send comments to us. One is by written mail. If you'd like to send in written comments to the amendment, feel free to send those to us at the address identified on this slide, which is here at 44 Holland Avenue in Albany. In addition, if you have comments that you'd like to submit and you would like to submit them electronically, again, you can submit them to us at the People First Waiver mailbox. which is peoplefirstwaiver@opwd.ny.gov. And again, that's the same email address you would use this evening if you run into any connection issues. Okay, so let's kind of discuss a little bit about, what is this waiver? We mentioned that tonight's presentation is with regards to a 1915C comprehensive waiver, but what is that? So what the waiver is it's an agreement between New York State and the federal government, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, our federal partners at CMS. And what the waiver does is it's the mechanism that really provides the authorization for the services that we deliver. So that what we're going to talk about a little bit later on is kind of the parts of the waiver. But, it's important to keep in mind that the waiver is our agreement with the federal government for how we're going to deliver services. But in addition to that agreement with our federal partners, our waiver is administered between both the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities as well as the Department of Health. So it's a collaborative effort between OPWDD and Department of Health. Department of Health is sort of the administrative arm of things. OPWDD is sort of the operational arm of things. Okay, so why do we need to do an amendment in the first place? Well, 1915C comprehensive waivers are renewed for 5-year blocks of time. We did just renew our waiver at the end of last calendar year. Whenever you establish a waiver renewal, you start off with waiver renewal as kind of your base level. Anytime you want to make a change to your waiver, it's done as an amendment to that initial agreement that was put in place. So in this case, we're referring to this amendment as Amendment 03. So how do we get to Amendment 03? Well, essentially, we recently made some edits to the waiver, some adjustments to the waiver through what's referred to as an Appendix K. And that provided some additional flexibilities in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And those adjustments, those changes were considered our first amendment to our waiver for this time period. And that was a waiver Amendment 01. We are anticipating that we may need to go back and make some revisions to that initial flexibility and the authority that was granted to respond to COVID-19. So we are anticipating that that will become Amendment 02. So for these changes that we're going to be talking about this evening, that will be considered a third amendment to our waiver renewal that, again, was approved at the end of last calendar year. So that is how we get to Waiver Amendment 03. And again, the why of the amendment is because we are proposing to make some changes to the original agreement. Remember, the waiver is an agreement with our federal partners. So that is the why of the amendment. Okay, so let's take a quick look at effective date. Again, here we are, it's in June, and we're going out for a public comment. The proposed effective date for this waiver amendment is October 1st, 2020. So that is the date that we are looking at. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how the waiver is organized. So again, being an agreement, there's lots of defined sections in the waiver that cover very specific topics. And again, this is a very large document. It's a 400-page document. So the first part of that document that you're going to see when you take a look at it is going to be the main section. And the main section really covers the purpose and review of the application itself. And those are going, for this file, it's going to be pages 1 through 14. The first appendix that we come to is Appendix A. That's going to cover waiver administration and operation, as well as DOH and OPWDD responsibilities, and that can be found on pages 14 through 34. Appendix B covers the areas of participant access and eligibility, waiver access and eligibility processes, and that information can be found on pages 34 through 55. Appendix C. Appendix C is really that section of the waiver that, really kind of provides a lot of description around the services that we offer and that we're authorized to provide through the waiver agreement. So Appendix C covers our participant services as well as the service descriptions, including service limits and provider qualifications. And that information can be found on pages 55 through 155 of this amendment. Appendix D, that covers participant-centered planning and service delivery as well as care management. That information can be found on pages 155 through 186. Appendix E. Appendix E is very specific to our self-directed services, and that covers pages 187 through 203. Appendix F, that covers participant rights, fair hearings, additional dispute resolution processes, and grievance and complaint system. That can be found on pages 204 to 206. And just to note that fair hearing process applies to all of our waiver services. So Appendix G covers participant safeguards, incident management. That can be located on pages 206 through 254. Appendix H covers our quality improvement strategy, as well as the New York State Department of Health and OPWDB internal and external processes for waiver quality. That's located on pages 254 through 262. Now, the next parts of the waiver that we're going to come to are going to kind of transition a little bit from the policy and programmatic areas of the waiver. These pieces really focus more on the financial and the fiscal end of things. So Appendix I is financial accountability, waiver audit procedures. That can be found on pages 262 through 286. Appendix J, that covers our cost neutrality demonstration, fiscal year projections. Again, remember it's a 5-year waiver period. So Appendix J breaks down those projections for each year. That's found on pages 286 through 310. And then lastly, Addendum A. Addendum A covers our rate methodologies and language for waiver services on pages 311 through 381. There are a few miscellaneous addendum attachments included in our waiver package at the end. Those are referred to as Addendum A1 through Addendum A5. Those are located on pages 382 through 401. So before we jump into our policy and programmatic changes that are going to take place, operational changes, I just kind of want to, summarize up what we've talked about so far. So at this point, we've discussed sort of how the waiver is organized, with the, how the waiver is laid out. We've discussed the public comment period and how to submit any public comment, any comments that you may have. So the purpose of laying out that information to this point has been to hopefully provide some clarity as to find the pieces of the waiver that may be of most interest to you as we work through the changes and assist you with isolating on those changes so that you can find them a little bit more easily. So as we transition into the operational and the policy type changes, I just want to note that there is going to be one small technical change to self-direction services that will be discussed a little bit later on in the fiscal section. However, other than that, this waiver amendment is not proposing to make any sort of significant changes to self-direction. So the first operational and policy change of note that we come to in this waiver amendment is with regards to the documentation of choice form signatures. That section can be found in Appendix B on page 54. And just as background, the documentation of individual choice to participate in and receive HCBS waiver services, it is a requirement for waiver enrollment. Now, the mechanism that we use for verifying that an individual has chosen to receive waiver services is the documentation of choices form. Now, currently with that form, signatures are required by the individual and or their advocate, regional office staff, as well as the individual's care manager. So in an effort to promote some streamlining of the process and, expediting the processing of these forms, OPWD is making a technical change to remove the requirement that the DDRO and the care manager sign off on the document. So again, we're trying to make this a little more streamlined. We're trying to make it a little bit quicker to kind of move through this process. And, this change will have no impact on the individuals. There are some other avenues to verify DDRO and care manager approval, such as documented through email and electronically. So this change that we're proposing, it will have no impact to individuals. Another change that we are making to the waiver, that we'd like to make to the waiver through this amendment, is removal of the CCO consent form from the life plan review. Now, again, just as a little bit of an overview to kind of, set the stage for what this change is. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, administration and management of the waiver is a partnership between OPWDD and the Department of Health. So an area where our two agencies work very closely together is to complete annual life plan review activities. Again, that's one of those requirements that are laid out in our agreement with our federal partners. So these review activities include checking to ensure that all required service documentation is complete and accurate for a random sample of individuals enrolled in the waiver for each review cycle. So after an internal review, we are proposing to make a technical change to the list of current documents required to complete the annual review by removing the CCO consent form. Now, just to be clear, this form will continue to be required, just not going to be included as part of the annual life plan review checklist of required items. So again, much like the documentation of choices form, removal of signatures, the change to remove the CCO consent form from the life plan review will have no impact on individuals. So on your slide, on the right-hand side, we move on to our second sort of operational policy change, and that is with regards to community habilitation service authorization. This change can be found in Appendix C, page 100. And essentially, we're proposing to add a sentence to the description of community habilitation to make clear that OPWDD will be implementing a review tool to meet the need for consistent decision-making throughout New York State. The guidance is under review, and it is anticipated that it will be implemented later in the year. So just to kind of add a little bit of clarity around that statement, any changes that would come out of this change in the process would be prospective changes. They wouldn't be retroactive, and they wouldn't apply to, individuals currently being served. They would be prospective changes for new service authorizations. And also, just to restate what I mentioned a few moments ago, these changes do not apply to self-direction. Ultimately and essentially what these changes boil down to is what we're really trying to do is, make these changes to promote fairness and equity throughout our service system. So another operational policy sort of change that we're implementing through this waiver amendment is with regards to environmental modifications, assistive technology, and vehicle modification service limits. If you're looking to find these sections in the waiver, you can find them in either Appendix C, either or, Appendix C and Addendum A, those two sections that I referenced, in the beginning as part of the organizational overview of the waiver. So if you're looking for the service limit changes in Appendix C, they're located on pages 97, 104, and 119. If you're looking for those in Addendum A, they're located on pages 369 and 370. So once again, as sort of background for this change, changes were made to the ATV mod EMOD service limits during Amendment 05 of the previous waiver. Remember, waivers are authorized in 5-year periods of time. So when I say Amendment 05, Amendment 05 took place last July, and that was under the prior 5-year waiver authorization period. So now that we've renewed our waiver at the end of last calendar year, and we've kind of reset the board, now we're working with a new series of amendments, which is how we get to Amendment 03. So just for clarity, we did make some changes under Amendment 05 of the previous waiver to align these services and their service limits with the Community First Choice Option Initiative. These changes included establishing a service limit of $15,000 per service. The change that we would like to make now is really to kind of add the word calendar year as a clarifying point. So what we're proposing is to make a change to service limits for each of these services to clarify that the $15,000 service limit is established per calendar year. So it's per service, per calendar year, $15,000 cap. And again, this change is intended to clarify how established service limits are being applied on an annual basis. So those are essentially the operational and policy changes that we're implementing for this waiver amendment. The next piece that we're going to talk about is going to be fiscal updates. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Kevin Valentis, who's going to set the stage and provide an overview of the fiscal.
Thanks, Don. So I'm going to be brief in my comments. Donna will be taking over for me from the Department of Health, to talk about more detail regarding the various rate methodology changes, and then I'll chime back in, about some other technical changes as it relates to the Commissioner's authority for the cost report submission deadlines. But I know, folks are interested in, the methodological changes that we're doing. And so just to set the stage here, I want to kind of go over the recent history. We had, an executive and an enacted budget proposal that does, before, the impacts of COVID were realized, we had a budget that was developed, that required some savings, right? We made, overall net investments in the OPWD service delivery system. However, those net investments did assume that there was some level of action in the financial plan to reduce rates of spend. At the time, we had talked, about the use of a similar treatment to various rates of reimbursement through the waiver, meaning an across-the-board rate reduction of an equivalent amount for each service. I know many folks had, comments and concerns over that across-the-board approach, and we listened to those comments and that feedback and looked at ways that we could be as least disruptive as possible to the provision of services. So what we did is we looked at certain components, and now we're talking exclusively about, ResHab, where we make payments for the non-delivery of service. And they're really arrayed in, I think, 3 mechanisms. The first is an occupancy factor, and that occupancy factor is, in essence, a payment for true vacancies, the difference between, the services provided and the overall provider's certified capacity. Occupancy payments can increase rates by as much as 5%. The other 2 mechanisms that we're also, looking to make methodological changes to as part of this waiver amendment involve retainer days, which are basically medical days that individuals are not otherwise in residence but are receiving an inpatient Medicaid service, somewhere else. And the final mechanism is a therapeutic leave day, which I think the easiest way to envision what a therapeutic leave day or a therapy day is basically a vacation day. But when you look at, the aggregate amount of these payments, the state in Medicaid does make substantial payments for days in which individuals are not otherwise in the residential programs. So with that kind of caveat, I'm going to transition it over to Donna. Again, just understanding that our goal was to be as least disruptive as possible and look to reduce payments where there weren't a direct provision of services.
Good evening, everyone. So I am just going to point out some places in the where you can find the fiscal changes that Kevin talked about. And the first one is the next slide. The first one is the occupancy adjustment that Kevin talked about, and it's for supervised IRA and for the services for the period beginning October 1st and thereafter, the adjustment shall be 0. Right now, as Kevin mentioned, this occupancy adjustment can be up to 5%, and you can find the exact change to this adjustment in Appendix I and Addendum A, pages 274, 314, 317, 18, and 349, and a bunch of places within the amendment. The second one is the retainer days. Effective October 1st, 2020, the retainer days for supervised residential habilitation will be reimbursed at 50% of the provider's established rate. As Kevin mentioned, this retainer days is for the day that individuals are otherwise receiving other Medicaid inpatient services, for example, in a hospital or in a nursing home. You can find those changes on Addendum A, page 316. The next adjustment is for therapy days, and beginning on October 1st, 2020, for supervised IRA, residential habilitation providers will be limited to 96 therapy days per rate year per person and will be reimbursed at 50% of their estimated rate. The therapy leave days back in 2014, when we transitioned this methodology from a monthly unit of service to a daily. At that time, 22 days represented 1 month. On average, there are 30 days in a month. So originally we had received unlimited therapy days, but since then, in looking at this, we wanted to put it back to what it was, which was 96 therapy days. Those therapy days are days that an individual goes home to their family, or an individual goes on vacation with their family, or is just not in the residence for some type of therapy. So those are therapy days. You can find the language in Addendum A, page 316. The next adjustment is for vacancy days. A reimbursement for supervised residential habilitation vacancy through an occupancy adjustment will cease on September 30th, 2020. These vacancy days represent time, true vacancy days. When an individual moves from one house to another, there is a time when the place the individual moved from has a vacancy, and you can find that language in Addendum A, page 317, 318, and 349. The next adjustment is community pre-voc services fees, the regions. Back, I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, last year we aligned the community HAB regions with the Department of Health regions. We did this, we aligned many of the regions prior to this. I think all the other services actually were aligned in 2014 when we redid the methodology. It aligned with the Department of Health regions. There was a few that were left out. One of those was Community HAB, which we aligned last year, and now we're realigning the community pre-voc services so that it aligns with the Department of Health regions as well. It becomes very confusing to explain to CMS and others why we have an OPWDD region, a rate region, a DOH region, all different regions. So we're trying to, a little at a time, align them all so that they're all aligned with the DOH region. And then the next one is self-direction.
So I can take that one. Hi, everyone. This is Kate Marley from OPWDD. We are making a small technical change to the IDGS, that's Individual Directed Goods and Services chart, that appears on page 395. That change is not an operational change or a policy change. It's really just clarifying language in the waiver that conforms with existing policy, and that is that transportation costs charged to IDGS are not allowed if those transportation costs are covered under a different methodology. So most frequently what that means is a person who self-directs also participates in a day habilitation program. The day habilitation program is paid for transportation to and from. So that person needs the day, in that instance, for the self-directed person, the day HEB program would need to pay for the transportation that can't be charged to IDGS in the person's individual budget. So again, just to be clear, just clarifying changes, not a change in policy.
So the final fiscal update, this is Kevin again, really deals with the expansion, I guess, of the definition of an unforeseeable circumstance as it relates to the provider deadline to submit cost reports. Right now, the language does specify certain natural disasters, and we wanted to give the commissioner an additional degree of flexibility to identify, appropriate instances that could otherwise adversely impact an agency's ability to fail to timely submit the cost report. So the language that we've added is, highlighted on the slide here, or other circumstances as determined by the OPW commissioner. This document, this change, can be found in several places, both in Appendix I and in Addendum A. On pages 263, 329, 336, 346, 348, 359, and page 360.
So at this point, we have finished our presentation for this evening. We are going to move into kind of a question and answer session.
A question that we received was if there is going to be a $15,000 per year limit on community habilitation services.
So, hi everyone, this is Kate Marley. There is no limit, dollar limit on community habilitation services. There never has been. It's not being implemented now. What we talked about earlier, just to make sure people are clear, is that there are certain services that have always had a limit or have for many, many years, and that is environmental modifications, vehicle modifications, and assistive technology. And in those cases, the existing limits were always $15,000. All we're doing here is clarifying that for those three services, and those three services alone, those limits are annual.
We received another question about what are these Appendix Ks?
So Appendix Ks are emergency measures that obviously were in the, everyone is well aware and working through the pandemic. And CMS allows emergency changes to waivers so that we can be flexible and address folks' needs as best we can using an Appendix K. They are time limited. They are published on the CMS website, and you can easily Google Appendix K, New York State, and OPWDD's Appendix K appears. They are rapidly approved and likely to be amended so that we can stay responsive, but they are time limited.
Another question we've received is, can you clarify what changes are being made in relation to self-direction?
Sure. Well, that's a great one. There's really very little here that is going to impact anyone with self-directed services in terms of what they do within their budget and within their services. So the only example within the changes that we are making here are services, transportation services, where we made the clarifying language change for transportation purchased through IDGS. I think we've had a lot of confusion and concern that where we talked about in community habilitation, the clarifying language around the DDRO review and need for consistency of review for community habilitation. I just want to be very clear. That applies to and will apply as we begin implementation to people who are new to services and not to self-direction. So there's a different set of policies around self-direction. The change that we made to the waiver related to community habilitation is about improving consistency, fairness, and equity for people who are coming to the DDRO requesting service authorization, but is not related to the self-direction process.
We also had a question come in about the retainer days. Are retainer days still limited to 14 days per person per calendar year, or is the limit 14 days times certified capacity?
This is Kevin. Donna, jump in if you want to add, but I mean, I think the old definition prior to the last, our last waiver amendment that took effect, well, the change in policy took effect last July 1st, went from 14 days per person limit for retainer days per rate year to 14 days times total certified capacity. That definition, 14 days times total certified capacity, is being maintained. The difference is the only change to the retainer policy that's being proposed would be that the rate that the provider bills for that retainer day will be calculated, as Donna indicated, at 50% of the operating rate for that residence.
Another question was asked, will the 50% rate changes be conducted in addition to 2% cuts across the board?
That's a good question, and it does require a specific response. We have an enacted budget financial plan, as I said before, that required we take savings actions to offset the investments being made in the OPWD service system. These proposed rate actions that you see in the waiver and that Donna talked about in detail a few minutes ago are intended to help us comply with that enacted budget resource allocation. I'm just trying to be clear here because I don't want to say that the across-the-board rate cut is in all perpetuity put aside, because we still have yet to know how the state is going to respond to the financial impacts that our overall response to COVID-19 has produced. So the simple question is, as it relates to achieving the enacted budget goals, we're pursuing these targeted actions in lieu of an across-the-board rate cut. However, if the financial situation proves to be as dire as forecast, we will likely need to take additional actions that could include, some other, rate adjustments. But as it relates to this proposal and trying to comply with what we've been directed to move forward with in terms of that enacted budget, we're electing to pursue these targeted vacancy adjustments in lieu of an across-the-board rate action.
Another question was asked of whether funding for community rehabilitation fees was being increased or decreased with these actions?
There's no change in community rehabilitation fees related to this amendment. So that stays as is. And as Kevin just explained, there are no additional changes to reimbursement that are being put forward in this amendment.
We also received questions on whether people would have an opportunity to provide comments on the community rehabilitation service authorization.
So the service authorization policy is being worked out with the districts to make sure it's understandable and can be implemented consistently across the state. There will be opportunity for comment, and I think we're particularly intending to engage with the Commissioners Developmental Disabilities Advisory Council. And there's one other point that I would like to just make, that there is nothing in implementing a policy about consistency and fairness in decision making that eliminates the fact that people have if there's a decision made that they don't agree with, there is a process for seeking redress of that, including fair hearings. None of that is eliminated with this. So I just wanted to make sure that people understood really the intent of what we're trying to do here.
The question was asked about whether the 50% funding rate for the therapy and retainer days will be after a provider hits the cap of 96 days or 14 days per certified capacity, or will all of the funding be cut 50%?
Regardless of the utilization of a therapy day or a retainer day, the rate of reimbursement will be at 50% of the established rate.
We received a question about any changes in community rehabilitation in relation to the Community First Choice Option State Plan.
Sure. Happy to clarify. The only change that we made to community rehabilitation in this action was to add the one sentence about the consistency of review for authorization purposes by our districts. All the language related to CFPO, existing language in place prior to this action. It was made probably a year ago, and there are no changes that are planned at this time related to community rehabilitation.
A clarifying question was asked, are the caps for AT-EMOD, VMOD $15,000 per year per person?
Per year, per person, per service. So for example, if I am a person who gets a vehicle modification in a year and I also need an environmental modification, both can happen in that year, and the two services each would be limited to 15. So a total of sort of 30 overall between the two services that person would need in a year.
Are there any changes being made to day rehabilitation within this amendment?
No, there are not changes being made to day rehabilitation. There is a lot of discussion, obviously, that is happening throughout New York State and, in fact, throughout the nation as we look at where the various communities in New York State are at in terms of the return to group settings for folks who receive services in those settings. So while there are no changes here to day rehabilitation, we are absolutely looking at how we can, begin the return to services and community integration.
A question was asked on whether the limitations for therapy days and on the retainer days are a monthly limit or a yearly limit.
Those limits are yearly. The 96, the limit of 96 is per year per individual.
We also received a question on what base year will be utilized for these changes.
Well, these changes start on 10/1 of this year. So we aren't going, there is no base year update of cost reports. We're going to be using the rates that are calculated. As you know, we calculate rates in January and July. So when the rates for July 1/20 are calculated, those would be the basis of the 10/1/20 rates. So we aren't changing cost report base, but we will be jumping off of the 7/1 rates, if you will.
We also received another clarifying question about the limitations for vehicle modifications. If somebody's vehicle modification would cost over $15,000, would the person be able to get that modification?
There is a review process that's in place so that if there is a need to exceed that level, and it's a particularly valid question, since I will say most of our vehicle modifications are going to probably exceed that threshold, then yes, they can exceed that. There is no need for a central office review of a request that is under that value, and they can be exceeded if medically necessary. That's the term of art, but it does need additional review and coordination before the project can be approved.
Another question was asked about any changes in this amendment. Are they related to the Community First Choice Option State Plan?
There are no changes in this waiver related to Community First Choice Option. The only changes we made, which are the ones we described here, were really clarifying language changes related to the limits for AT, EMODs, and VMODs, as we discussed, and then the language in community rehabilitation. But there are no changes in this action related to the implementation of CFCO.
Okay, I believe that is all the questions that we have received. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us this evening. If you have any additional questions or comments, please submit them to the People First Waiver mailbox that's up on the slide on your screen right now. People First Waiver, all one word, at opwdd.ny.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, and be safe.